The Velanthari were one of the oldest species in the known galaxy, and they had walked among the stars for over 50,000 years. Before humans even learned to make fire, their bodies were tall and slender, and their skin glowed with soft light that changed colors based on their emotions, and they considered themselves the most advanced civilization in existence. When humans first made contact with the galactic community just 200 years ago, the Velanthari looked at them with a mixture of curiosity and pity, because humans were so young and so primitive and so fragile. The Velanthari had no wars and no violence and no disease, because they had evolved past such things millions of years ago, and they could not understand why humans still carried weapons and built hospitals and trained soldiers too. Them humans were like children playing with dangerous toys. Princess Alvathara was the third daughter of King Soanthos the Radiant, and she was young by Velanthari standards at only 412 years old. Her skin glowed in beautiful shades of violet and silver, and she was known throughout the kingdom for her kindness and her curiosity about other species. When her father announced a diplomatic mission to Concord Station Epsilon 7, she begged him to let her go, because she wanted to see humans up close and learn about their strange customs. King was reluctant at first, because the station was in neutral territory where many species gathered, and not all of them were friendly to the Velanthari, but Alvathara was persuasive, and eventually her father agreed to let her travel with a full security escort aboard the royal vessel Starweaver's Grace. The journey took 3 days through hyperspace, and Alvathara spent most of that time reading about human history and culture. She found them fascinating in a tragic sort of way, because they lived such short lives and yet accomplished so much in their brief existence. Human might live for only 80 or 90 years, while a Velanthari could live for thousands, and yet humans had spread across dozens of star systems in just 2 centuries. They were driven by something the Velanthari had lost long ago, and Alvathara wanted to understand what that something was. Concord Station Epsilon 7 was enormous, and it floated in the space between 3 different star systems and served as neutral ground for diplomacy and trade ships from dozens of species docked there every day, and the corridors were filled with beings of every shape and size, and Colorelavera walked through the station with her guards surrounding her, and she marveled at the diversity of life that existed in the galaxy. She saw the insectoid Kreth with their clicking mandibles and their compound eyes. She saw the massive Gorath, who stood 3 meters tall and communicated through deep rumbling sounds that shook the floor. And she saw the humans, who were smaller than she expected and softer looking than she imagined. They moved through the station with a strange energy that other species lacked, and they always seemed to be in a hurry to get somewhere. Alvathara was observing a group of human merchants when the explosion happened. The bomb had been planted by Kreth separatists who opposed the Velanthari presence on the station, and they had hidden it in a maintenance shaft on Deck 14. When it detonated, the blast tore through the corridor like a wave of fire and destruction. Elevivs was thrown against the wall, and she felt something sharp pierce her chest, and then everything went dark when she opened her eyes. She was lying on the floor, and her guards were dead around her, and her beautiful violet glow was fading to a dim gray. She tried to breathe, but something was wrong inside her body, and she could feel the crystalline fluid that served as her blood pooling beneath her. Pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced, because Velanthari rarely felt pain, and their bodies were not designed to handle trauma. She heard voices around her speaking in languages she did not recognize, and then she saw faces looking down at her with expressions of horror and fear. Someone was pressing something against her chest, and someone else was shouting for help. The Velanthari physicians arrived within minutes, because they had been stationed on the royal vessel, and they pushed through the crowd to reach their Princess Dr. Teleneth was the senior physician, and his skin pulsed with shades of panic and grief as he scanned Alvathara's injuries. "What He saw made his glow dim to nearly nothing. The shrapnel had destroyed her secondary heart completely, and her primary heart was failing from the strained crystalline fluid was leaking from multiple wounds, and her thoracic membrane had been torn in 3 places. In all his centuries of practice, Telenoth had never seen injuries this severe because Valentari simply did not experience violence. Their medicine was designed for illness and cellular degeneration and the slow decay of old age. It was not designed for this. He looked at his colleagues, and they looked back at him, and none of them knew what to do. Their healing frequencies could encourage cells to regenerate, but they could not repair a destroyed heart or stop massive fluid loss. Their bioharmonic resonators could ease pain and promote wellness, but they were useless against traumatic injury. Telenoth knelt beside the princess, and his skin shifted to the deep gray of mourning. She has minutes, he announced to the crowd, and we cannot save here. A murmur of despair rippled through the gathered Valentari, and several began the death chants that would guide her spirit to the next realm. But then a voice cut through the mourning move. The voice belonged to a human woman who was pushing through the crowd with no regard for protocol or respect. She was shorter than the Valentari, and her skin did not glow, and her dark hair was streaked with gray. Her clothing was stained with blood, and she carried equipment that looked crude and primitive. Dr. Elena Vasquez was the chief trauma surgeon at Concord Station Epsilon 7, and she had already saved 3 lives that hour from the bombing. She had heard about the injured Valentari princess, and she had come running. Telenoth looked at her with something close to disgust, because this human thought she could succeed where Valentari physicians had failed human. He said coldly, "This is not your concern, and your primitive techniques cannot help her." Elena ignored him and knelt beside the princess, and her scanner was already running over the wounds. She saw the destroyed secondary heart and the failing primary and the massive fluid loss, and she understood why the Valentari doctors had given up. But Elena had not become a trauma surgeon by giving up. She had spent 20 years learning how to save people who should not be saved, and she had pulled patients back from death more times than she could count. "Your princess is dying," she said to Telenoth, "because you do not know what to do." She looked up at him with fire in her eyes. "I do now. Move or watch her die while you explain to your king why you chose pride over his daughter's life." The operating theater on Concord Station Epsilon 7 was designed to accommodate patients from dozens of different species, and it had equipment from many different medical traditions. Elena Vasquez commandeered the largest surgical suite and ordered a team to prepare for emergency cardiac surgery. The Valentari physicians followed her because they did not know what else to do, and because some small part of them wanted to see what this human thought she could accomplish. Dr. Telenoth stood in the corner with his arms crossed and his skin pulsing with skeptical orange light. He had practiced medicine for over 600 years, and he had never seen anyone attempt what this human was proposing. The princess lay on the operating table, and her glow had faded to almost nothing, and her breathing was shallow and weak. Elena's team moved around her with practiced efficiency, and Nurse Chen was monitoring vital signs while Dr. Okonkwo prepared the anesthesia. "We need to work fast," Elena said as she scrubbed her hands, "and her secondary heart is gone, and the primary is failing from the overload." She pulled up the scans on the display and pointed to the damaged areas. "I am going to reroute her circulatory system to bypass the destroyed heart completely, and the primary can handle the full load if I reduce the resistance in the major vessel." Telenoth stepped forward with his skin flashing in alarm. "That is impossible," he declared, "and no one has ever attempted such a procedure on." The Valentari patient Elena did not look at him as she pulled on her surgical gloves. "No Valentari has ever attempted it," she corrected him, "but humans have been doing cardiac bypass surgery for over 400 years. She moved to the table and picked up a scalpel, and the Valentari physicians gasped in horror. "You cannot cut her open," Telenoth shouted, and the voluntary body is sacred and must not be violated with Blaze. Elena paused and looked at him with cold eyes. Your sacred body is dying, she said simply, and I can save her, or you can let her die with her body intact, but you cannot have both. She turned back to the princess and made the first incision. The crystalline fluid that served as voluntary blood welled up from the cut, and it was a pale blue color that shimmered in the surgical lights. Elena had studied voluntary anatomy during her training, but she had never operated on one before, and she relied on her scanners to guide her through the unfamiliar tissue. The internal structure was different from human biology, but the basic principles were the same, and hearts pumped fluid and vessels carried it and valves controlled the flow. She worked her way through the layers of tissue until she reached the chest cavity, and what she saw made her pause for just a moment. Secondary heart was completely destroyed, and it was nothing but shredded tissue and shattered crystalline structures. The primary heart was beating erratically as it struggled to compensate for the loss of its partner, and Elena could see that it was failing. She has maybe 5 minutes, Elena announced to her team, and I need the vascular clamps and the synthetic graft material. Dr. Okonkwo handed her the instruments, and Elena began the delicate work of rerouting the blood vessels. The voluntary physicians watched in horrified fascination as she worked with her hands inside the princess's chest cavity, and they had never seen anything like it. Their medicine used frequencies and resonance and gentle harmonic waves that encouraged the body to heal itself. This human was physically manipulating organs and cutting vessels and forcing the body to change through sheer mechanical intervention. It was barbaric and primitive, and yet Elena's hands moved with a precision and confidence that none of them could deny. You are killing her, Teleneth shouted as Elena clamped off a major vessel. I'm saving her, Elena replied without looking up. And now be quiet or leave. She connected the synthetic graft to bypass the destroyed secondary heart, and the material was a human invention designed to integrate with biological tissue. No one knew if it would work with voluntary physiology, but Elena had no other options. The primary heart stuttered, and the monitors began to alarm. She is coding, Nurse Chen announced, and her heart is stopping. Elena grabbed the manual cardiac stimulator from the tray and pressed it directly against the primary heart. You cannot simply force a heart to beat, Teleneth cried out in disbelief. Elena ignored him and activated the device. The electrical pulse surged through the alien tissue, and the heart contracted once and then fell still. Elena shocked it again, and the heart contracted and stopped. She shocked it a third time, and this time the heart continued beating on its own. Rhythm was weak and irregular, but it was beating, and Elena allowed herself a single breath of relief before continuing her workover. The next 6 hours she performed procedure after procedure that the voluntary physicians had never imagined. She repaired the torn thoracic membrane using techniques developed during Earth's most violent wars. She grafted synthetic vessels to replace the damaged ones using materials that human scientists had created to save victims of accidents and battles. She transfused synthetic fluid to replace what the princess had lost because there was no stored voluntary blood available, and through it all she talked to her team in calm, measured tones, telling them what she needed and what she was doing and what came next. The voluntary physicians said nothing because they had no words for what they were. Witnessing this human was fighting death itself, and she was refusing to surrender. And she was using every tool and technique at her disposal to keep the princess alive. At one point, the primary heart began to fail again, and Elena shocked it back to life 4 more times. At another point, a vessel she had just repaired began to leak, and she repaired it again. At another point, the princess stopped breathing entirely, and Elena manually ventilated her lungs while continuing to operate with her other hand. The Okonkwo watched her with something like awe, because even by human standards, what Elena was doing was extraordinary. She had been operating for 5 hours without a break, and her hands were steady, and her mind was clear. and she showed no signs of fatigue or doubt. This was what humans were capable of when they refused to accept defeat finally after 6 hours and 17 separate procedures. Elena stepped back from the table. The princess's skin flickered with a faint blue light. It was weak and pale, but it was there, and it meant she was alive. She will need weeks of recovery, Elena said, as she stripped off her blood-soaked gloves, and her chest will never be the same, and she will have scars that your people have probably never seen before. She looked at Telenoth with exhausted eyes. But she will live, the Voluntari physician stared at her, and his skin cycled through colors that Elena did not recognize. His entire understanding of humans had just been shattered, and he did not know what to say. Elena did not wait for a response because she had other patients to check on. She walked out of the operating theater and left the Voluntari to process what they had witnessed behind her. The princess's glow slowly grew stronger as her body began to heal. Part 2. The impossible surgery. The operating theater on Concord Station Epsilon 7 was designed to accommodate patients from dozens of different species, and it had equipment from many different medical traditions. Elena Vasquez commandeered the largest surgical suite and ordered her team to prepare for emergency cardiac surgery. The Voluntari physicians followed her because they did not know what else to do, and because some small part of them wanted to see what this human thought she could accomplish. Telenoth stood in the corner with his arms crossed and his skin pulsing with skeptical orange light. He had practiced medicine for over 600 years, and he had never seen anyone attempt what this human was proposing. The princess lay on the operating table, and her glow had faded to almost nothing, and her breathing was shallow and weak. Elena's team moved around her with practiced efficiency, and Nurse Chen was monitoring vital signs while Dr. Okonkwo prepared the anesthesia. We need to work fast, Elena said as she scrubbed her hands. And her secondary heart is gone, and the primary is failing from the overload. She pulled up the scans on the display and pointed to the damaged areas. I am going to reroute her circulatory system to bypass the destroyed heart completely, and the primary can handle the full load if I reduce the resistance in the major vessel. Telenoth stepped forward with his skin flashing in alarm. That is impossible, he declared, and no one has ever attempted such a procedure on a Voluntari patient. Elena did not look at him as she pulled on her surgical gloves. No Voluntari has ever attempted it, she corrected him, but humans have been doing cardiac bypass surgery for over 400 years. She moved to the table and picked up a scalpel, and the Voluntari physicians gasped in horror. You cannot cut her open, Telenoth shouted, and the Voluntari body is sacred and must not be violated with blades. Elena paused and looked at him with cold eyes. Her sacred body is dying, she said simply, and I can save her. Or you can let her die with her body intact, but you cannot have both. She turned back to the princess and made the first incision. Crystalline fluid that served as Voluntari blood welled up from the cut, and it was a pale blue color that shimmered in the surgical lights. Elena had studied Voluntari anatomy during her training, but she had never operated on one before, and she relied on her scanners to guide her through the unfamiliar tissue. The internal structure was different from human biology, but the basic principles were the same, and hearts pumped fluid, and vessels carried it, and valves controlled the flow. She worked her way through the layers of tissue until she News of the bombing and the princess's miraculous survival spread across the galaxy faster than light itself, because when royalty was involved, nothing stayed secret for long. Within hours, every major news network was broadcasting the story, and the name Elena Vasquez was being spoken in languages she had never heard of, but the person who received the news first was the one who mattered most. King Sorrenthos the Radiant was in his throne room on the Voluntari homeworld when his chief advisor rushed in with terror in his eyes. The king listened to the report of the bombing, and his skin darkened to the deep crimson of rage and grief. But then the advisor told him about the human doctor and what she had done, and the king's colors shifted to something no one in the court had ever seen before. He gave orders immediately, and within the hour, the royal flagship, Throne of Eternal Radiance, was launched toward Concord Station Epsilon 7. The ship was massive, and it was the size of a small moon, and its hull gleamed with crystals that had been harvested from dying stars. It carried enough firepower to destroy entire fleets, and it had not left the homeworld in over 300 years when it dropped out of hyperspace near the station. Every other ship in the sector moved aside because no one wanted to be in the path of an angry Valentari. King Elena was sleeping in the on-call room when the summons came, and she had been awake for almost 30 hours, and her body was exhausted. A station security officer woke her with an apologetic expression and told her that the Valentari king had requested her presence immediately. Elena wanted to argue that she needed rest, but she knew that refusing a king was not wise, especially when that king's daughter was currently recovering in her hospital. She splashed water on her face and changed into clean scrubs and followed the security officer to the docking bay. What she saw there made her stop in her tracks. The royal shuttle was unlike anything she had ever seen, and it glowed with inner light, and its surface seemed to shift and flow like liquid crystal. Valentari guards in ceremonial armor stood at attention, and their faces were unreadable, but their skin pulsed with colors that suggested tension and hostility. Lena straightened her spine and walked toward them because she had faced death in the operating room, and she would not be intimidated by pretty lights and fancy armor. The shuttle ride to the flagship was silent, and the guards did not speak to her, and she did not try to make conversation. When the shuttle docked and the doors opened, Elena found herself in a corridor that seemed to stretch forever, and the walls glowed with soft light, and the floor was made of something that felt like warm glass beneath her feet. More guards escorted her through the ship, and she tried to memorize the route but gave up after the 7th turn. Finally, they reached a massive door that was twice as tall as any human, and it opened silently to reveal the throne room beyond. Elena had seen images of grand halls and royal chambers in movies and history books, but nothing had prepared her for this. The room was enormous, and the ceiling was so high she could barely see it, and the walls were covered with murals that depicted the history of the Valentari people. Thousands of courtiers lined the sides of the room, and their combined glow filled the space with soft shifting light. And at the far end, sitting on a throne that seemed to be carved from a single perfect crystal, was King Sarantos the Radiant. He was old, and Elena could see it in the depth of his glow and the weight of his presence, and he radiated power and authority. Like heat from a star, she walked toward him, and the courtiers parted to let her pass, and she could feel their eyes on her and their colors shifting with emotions she could not read. When she reached the base of the throne, she stopped and wondered if she should bow or kneel or do something else. She decided to simply stand and wait, because she was a doctor, not a diplomat, and she did not know the proper protocols. The king studied her for a long moment, and his glow cycled through several colors before settling on a deep, thoughtful blue. "You are the human physician," he said, and his voice was deep and resonant, and it seemed to fill the entire room. And Elena replied, "My advisors tell me what you did was impossible," the king continued, "and they say that Valentari anatomy should not have responded to your techniques." He paused, and his glow flickered slightly. "They suggest it was luck, or that my daughter would have survived regardless of your intervention." Lena felt anger rise in her chest because she had not slept in over 30 hours, and she had just saved a life that everyone else had given up on, and she was not going to stand here and be told it was luck. "Your advisors were not there," she said, and her voice was steady despite her exhaustion. "And your daughter." At 4 minutes before total cardiac failure, she met the king's gaze without flinching. "I gave her back her life, and if you would like to debate methodology, I am happy to do so, but not while standing in a room full of people who would rather pretend. Humans are still banging rocks together, eh?" GSP rippled through the court, and several advisors' skin flared with angry crimson because no one spoke to the king that way. But King Sorrentos did something unexpected. He laughed. The sound was rich and warm, and it echoed through the throne room, and the courtiers stared in shock because they had not heard their king laugh in centuries. 3,000 years, he said when the laughter faded, and 3,000 years since anyone has spoken to me with such directness. His glow shifted to something warmer, and he rose from his throne and began descending the steps. Toward Harry asked my daughter what she remembered from the attack. He said as he walked, and do you know what she told me? Elena shook her head. She said she was falling into darkness, and then there was a light. The king continued, and a small fierce light that refused to let her go. He stopped in front of her, and Elena had to crane her neck to look up at his face because he was nearly 3 meters tall. That light was you, Dr. Vasquez, he said softly, and your will and your refusal to accept defeat. Elena did not know what to say, so she said nothing. The Voluntari do not forget our debts, the king continued, and what you have given me cannot be measured in any currency. He looked down at her with something like wonder in his ancient eyes. My daughter's life is worth more than all the wealth in my kingdom, and you gave it back to me when everyone else said it was impossible. Now I must decide how to repay a debt that can never truly be repaid. The throne room fell completely silent as King Sorrentos stood before Elena, and the courtiers held their breath because they knew something important was about to happen. The king's glow had shifted to a color that none of them had seen before, and it was a deep golden hue that seemed to pulse with ancient power. I have ruled my people for over 4,000 years, he said, and in that time I have given many rewards to many beings. He paused, and his eyes never left Elena's face. Wealth and titles and lands and ships and all the things that other species seemed to value so highly. Elena remained silent because she sensed he was not finished. But you are different, Dr. Vasquez, the king continued, and I can see it in your eyes, and I could hear it in the way my daughter spoke of you. He began to pace slowly, and his footsteps made no sound on the crystal floor. You did not save my daughter for reward or recognition or political advantage, he said, and you saved her because that is who you are. Elena nodded slightly because he was right, and she had never thought about reward when she was fighting to keep the princess alive. The king stopped pacing and turned to face her again. I offer you something that no alien has ever received in the entire history of my people, he announced, and his voice carried to every corner of the room. A murmur rippled through the courtiers because they could not imagine what their king was about to say. Offer you the Voluntari genetic codex, the king said, and complete and unredacted, and every secret of our biology and our evolution and our biochemistry. The silence that followed was so complete that Elena could hear her own heartbeat. She did not fully understand what he was offering, but she could tell from the reactions around her that it was something extraordinary. The courtiers' skin was flashing through colors of shock and disbelief and outrage, and several of them looked like they might collapse. Your Majesty, one advisor stepped forward, and his skin was mottled with distress. And this is unprecedented. His voice trembled as he spoke. The Codex is sacred, he continued, and it contains the secrets of our immortality and our biological perfection, and to give it to primitives would be. He stopped because he could not find words strong enough. The king turned to look at the advisor, and his glow darkened dangerously. To give it to the woman who saved my daughter's life, the king corrected him, and his voice was cold and sharp. The advisor shrank back, and his skin faded to a submissive gray. Elena finally spoke because she needed to understand what was happening. What exactly is this genetic codex, she asked. The king's glow softened as he turned back to her. It is the accumulated biological knowledge of my species, he explained, and 50,000 years of research and discovery and understanding. He gestured, and a holographic display appeared in the air between them, showing complex molecular structures and genetic sequences. contains the secrets of how we live for thousands of years," he continued, "and how we resist disease, and how our bodies maintain themselves indefinitely." Elena stared at the display, and her mind raced with the implications. With this knowledge, she said, humanity could cure diseases you do not yet have names for, and you could extend your lifespans by centuries, and you could understand biology at a level that took us millions of years to achieve. Elena understood now why the courtiers were so shocked. And this was not just a gift, but a transformation. She also understood why the Voluntari guarded it so jealously, because knowledge like this was power beyond measure. Species have gone to war for fragments of this information, the king said, as if reading her thoughts. And the Kreth separatists who planted the bomb that injured my daughter did so partly because we refused to share even basic longevity treatments with them. He stepped closer to Elena, and his glow intensified. "And now I am offering all of it to you." Elena's mind was spinning with questions and doubts, and she thought about what this would mean for humanity. Diseases that had plagued her species for thousands of years could be cured, and cancer, and heart disease, and Alzheimer's, and all the conditions that had stolen so many lives. Children born with genetic defects could be healed, and elderly people could live to see their great-grandchildren grow up. It was almost too much to comprehend. Why, she asked finally, and why give this to humans of all species? The king smiled, and it was a sad smile full of ancient wisdom. "Because your species earned it," he said, turned and walked a few steps away, and his glow shifted through contemplative colors. "Do you know why your techniques worked, Dr. Vasquez, when ours failed?" Elena had theories, but she shook her head. "Because your species has spent every moment of its existence fighting to survive," the king said. "And you learn to heal because you first learned to harm, and you understand death because you have lived with it always at your shoulder." He turned back to face her. "We forgot," he admitted, "and we became so advanced and so peaceful that we forgot what it meant to struggle." His glow dimmed with something like shame. "When true crisis came, we stood helpless and watched while a primitive showed us what we had lost." Elena felt a strange mixture of pride and sadness, because she understood what he was saying. Humanity's violent history and constant struggles had given them something that the peaceful Voluntari had lost, and it was the ability to fight against impossible odds. The king extended his hand, and a small crystalline sphere materialized in his palm, and it glowed with inner light and seemed to contain entire galaxies within its depths. "This is the physical medium containing the codex," he said, "and it is worth more than entire star systems, and it holds the key to biological immortality." He held it out to her. "Take it, Dr. Vasquez," he said, "and not as payment, because no payment could ever suffice for what you have given me." His glow shifted to warm gold. "Take it as recognition and as hope that perhaps your stubborn, impossible species will remind the galaxy what it means to truly fight for life." Elena reached out and took the sphere, and it was warm in her hand, and she could feel a faint vibration as if it were alive. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. The king nodded, and then he did something that made every courtier in the room gasp with shock. He bowed to her, not a small nod of acknowledgement, but a full formal bow that a Voluntari king had not given to anyone in over 1,000 years. "Thank you, Dr. Vasquez," he said, as he straightened, "and for reminding an old king that there is still wonder in the universe." Elena returned to Concord Station Epsilon 7, 3 days after receiving the genetic codex, and she carried with her a gift that would change the course of human history. The sphere sat in a secure container that would change the course of human history. The sphere sat in a secure container that the Voluntari had provided, and it hummed with quiet energy, as if eager to share its secrets with a new species. News of the gift had spread across human space, and Elena found herself greeted at the station by a delegation from Earth's United Medical Consortium. They were scientists and doctors and government officials, and they looked at her with a mixture of awe and Disbelief. Dar Vasquez, the lead scientist, said as she stepped off the shuttle. And is it true what they are saying? Elena held up the container and the sphere inside, pulsed with soft light. It is true, she confirmed, and the Volanthary King gave us their complete genetic codex. The scientist's hands trembled as she took the container, and her eyes were wet with tears. Do you understand what this means? She whispered. And we could cure everything, and cancer and heart disease and genetic disorders and aging. Itself. Elena nodded because she understood better than anyone. That is why he gave it to us, she said, and not as a reward, but as a responsibility. The codex was transported to Earth under the heaviest security humanity had ever assembled, and scientists from every nation gathered to study its contents. What they found exceeded their wildest expectations. The Volanthary had mapped every aspect of their biology, down to the molecular level, and they understood how cells aged and how diseases formed, and how the body could be encouraged to repair itself indefinitely within months. The first treatments based on the codex were being developed, and within years, diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia began to fall one by one. Cancer became treatable in all its forms, and heart disease was preventable, and genetic disorders could be corrected before a child was even born. Human lifespans began to extend, and the first generation of humans who might live for centuries was already being born. But Elena did not stay to watch the revolution she had started. She returned to her work at Concord Station Epsilon 7 because there were still patients who needed her, and still lives to be saved. Her fame had spread across the galaxy, and she received offers from every major government and corporation and research institution. She turned them all down because she was a doctor and her place was in the hospital, not in a laboratory or a boardroom. 6 months after her encounter with the king, she was eating lunch in the hospital cafeteria when a familiar figure sat down across from her. Princess Alvathora's glow had returned to its full brilliance, and her skin shimmered with beautiful violet and silver light. She looked healthy and strong, and there was no sign of the terrible injuries that had nearly killed her. Dr. Vasquez, the princess said with a warm smile, and I have been looking for you. Elena set down her sandwich and smiled back. Your Highness, she said, and you look well. The princess laughed, and the sound was like crystal bells. I feel well, she said, and thanks to you. She reached across the table and took Elena's hand, and her skin was warm and soft. I wanted to thank you personally, she said, and my father gave you a great gift, but I wanted to give you something as well. Elena shook her head. You do not owe me anything, she said, and I was just doing my job. The princess's glow shifted to a thoughtful blue. You could have asked for anything, she said, and wealth and power and a position in our court, and my father would have given you whatever you wanted. She tilted her head and studied Elena with curious eyes. Why did you take the codex? Instead, Elena considered the question carefully, because it deserved a thoughtful answer. Because I am a doctor, she said finally, and I took an oath to do no harm and to heal the sick. She looked at the princess with tired but sincere eyes. You were sick, and I healed you, and the codex will let us heal millions more, and that is worth more than any personal reward I could have asked for. Princess's glow shifted through several colors that Elena did not recognize. My father was right about you, she said softly. What did he say? Elena asked. That humans are impossible, the princess replied with a smile, and that you should not exist. She leaned back in her chair, and her glow settled into a warm gold. A species with no natural weapons and no psychic abilities and no inherent biological advantages, and yet you simply refuse to accept your limitations. Lena smiled and picked up her sandwich again. We are stubborn, she admitted, and it is probably our best quality. The princess laughed again, and then her expression became more serious. My father said something else, she continued, and he said the galaxy is fortunate that humans chose to be healers instead of conquerors. Ella chewed thoughtfully and considered those words. Give us time, she said with a slight smile, and we are still figuring out what we want to. Beatty. Princess stood, and her glow brightened with amusement. I Look forward to watching, she said. And whatever humanity becomes, I suspect it will be extraordinary. She turned to leave, but paused at the door. Thank you, Dr. Vasquez, she said one more time, and for the light in the darkness. Then she was gone, and Elena was alone with her cold sandwich and her thoughts. She looked out the cafeteria window at the ships moving through the stations, docking bays, and she saw vessels from dozens of different species going about their business. Somewhere out there, a Baya Preth merchant was teaching a human child a card game, and a voluntary diplomat was learning to appreciate Earth poetry. Somewhere out there, scientists were using the genetic codex to develop cures that would save billions of lives over the coming centuries. Somewhere out there, a species that had been dismissed as primitive and young was beginning to earn its place among them. Stars. Elena finished her sandwich and stood up and stretched her tired muscles. She had patients to see and surgeries to perform and lives to save. The galaxy was vast and full of wonders, and humanity was just getting started. She walked out of the cafeteria and back toward the operating rooms, because that was where she belonged. Behind her, the stars continued to shine, and somewhere among them the future was being written one life at a time. And if that future was a little brighter because of what one human doctor had done, then that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.